I've wanted to sit down with Ambassador Robert O'Brien since first hearing about his work on the Middle East Abraham Accords while serving as the National Security Advisor under President Donald Trump. That alone was a remarkable achievement and only one part of his long career of service to America. Today, he visited our offices and we had a fascinating conversation about his experiences and his thoughts on the challenges we're facing with Iran, Russia, and China. So I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here at PragerU. And from what Dennis started in a very humble fashion, it's turned into quite a great institution.
One of the funny things about our encounter was that you were introduced to me as an ambassador. And I was like, well, what country was he the ambassador to? And somebody explained to me that you weren't exactly an ambassador to a country, you were an ambassador for hostages. And so educate me a little bit about that term and how did you gain that title, ambassador?
So in 2018, I became the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, or it's called in government the SPIHA. And that position was established in the prior to the Trump administration. And the goal of that person was to go find Americans who were held hostage or detained wrongfully by governments abroad, and either negotiate or use the military to bring them back home.
How did you become the person who negotiates against hostages? Are you super scary, super convincing? What is it?
I think I was a lawyer in LA for long enough, so I had, negotiating with plaintiff lawyers in Los Angeles gave me some good experience. But I'd spent time in and out of government throughout my career, and when the Trump administration called and asked me to undertake this role, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back into government, but much of my career I've spent overseas. I've done international arbitrations all over the world. And I always thought, what happens if my plane's taken or if I'm taken hostage? Will someone come find me? And so my wife and I prayed about it, and I thought, this is the right thing to do. And I knew some of the hostage cases that were out there, and I wanted to go see if I could help bring some folks home.
How did you get from the role of hostage negotiator to, national security advisor?
It was as surprising to me as probably to the rest of the country. And as the hostage envoys, we started to bring people home, and we had some success. I think the president's someone who values success, and it was a metric that he could see as we brought people home, and came to the Oval Office with them, and they were able to tell their story. That I think that was something that at least put me in the hunt for the position when it opened up, and we interviewed, and the interviews apparently went well because he offered me the job.
Winner. I want you.
Well, there were a lot of good people that he was talking to, but it was an honor and a privilege to serve not just the president, but the country in that role.
What was it like working with President Trump?
We got a lot done. So he was a decisive leader. He'd make decisions. And so, what I tried to do every day, the prayer I had in the morning was, every morning I'd pray that we'd keep America safe that day. And then I'd come into the office, and I had a terrific team of people around me, senior folks and junior folks detailed from every agency in the government. And we'd meet every day and try and figure out what's the best advice we can give the president, what's the best intelligence we can give the president, how do we tee up the issues so that he can make the decisions that we need to make to keep the country safe. And he always took those meetings very seriously. It would usually be the Vice President, Mike Pence, and Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, oftentimes Steve Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, Gina Haspel, the Director of the CIA, and the President and I would get together, and we'd take a look at these tough issues, and whether it was Russia or Iran or China, whether it was an issue like COVID, whether it was a hostage case, and what decisions do we need to make to try and get a great outcome for the American people.
What are things that you remember as just highlights of your success there? Well,
look, I think the thing that people will remember, historians will write about 50 years from now, and maybe not in today's polarized environment, but 50 years from now, people are going to talk about the Abraham Accords. I mean, it was, the joke is always, and I remember, just as a lawyer trying to negotiate a case, people would say, this is harder than bringing peace to the Middle East.
Totally.
It became a cliche, right?
So true.
We were never going to have peace in the Middle East. It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo and the president and myself and others, and Mnuchin, we decided to give it a shot. And everyone said it's a fool's errand. Talked to a lot of former diplomats and former senior officials who said, don't waste your time with it. You won't get peace in the Middle East. And we got a great deal done. And I was just in Israel 2 weeks ago. The lives of people in Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco are changing because of the Abraham Accords. And so that's something I think when historians look at the Trump administration, absent the kind of the controversies of the day, they're going to look back at that as being a real mark of achievement for the United States of America, not just for the president.
A lot of people responded to me when I told them that the Abraham Accords is a big deal. They said, oh, well, it's not really a big deal, and, who cares anyway? I mean, what's your answer to that?
Well, the answer is for 40 years, up until the time of the Abraham Accords, during Israel's entire existence, they'd been at war with their Arab neighbors. And they'd only had two peace accords. One was the Camp David Accord, where we had peace with at least economic normalization and diplomatic normalization with Egypt. And then later in the Clinton years, we got a deal between Israel and Jordan. And the American president brokered both those deals. And in the Abraham Accords, we brought peace to Israel, to the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Morocco, the government of Sudan. And Sudan was actually in a state of war with Israel. That it not only was a diplomatic normalization, but we ended a war between the countries. And then we also got some other countries. The primary one was Kosovo, which is a Muslim-majority country in Europe, and we were negotiating a separate peace deal between Kosovo and Serbia, which we got done. And as part of that deal, we were able to get the Kosovars to recognize Israel, and not just recognize them, but put their embassy in Jerusalem. And the Serbians agreed to it. So it was really we had some great momentum. And when people say, why is it important? There are geopolitical reasons, and we can talk about those. There are reasons, economic reasons, but also peace for peace sake is important. And I think people don't realize how important it is to have peace in the world. I mean, we see a war going on in Ukraine. We see the Chinese threats against Taiwan. To see a region that was racked by war and to see peace breaking out there is something good for the human spirit, and it's good for humanity as a whole.
Beautiful. I mean, peace is so beautiful, and it can really only be accomplished through strength.
Well, right? Strength and the courage to negotiate.
Right.
There were a lot of people in the region who weren't in favor of peace, and in the past, peacemakers have been killed. And so it took a lot of courage. It took political courage, but also took physical courage for these leaders to get out in front of their people and decide we're gonna change the world in which we live and have a better world for our kids and grandkids.
Yeah. There's a general sentiment in the conservative movement that what happens outside the United States doesn't really matter. What's your response to that?
Well, I think it matters greatly. And number one, having allies is a great advantage that the U.S. has over Russia and over China. I mean, China and Russia don't really have any friends. They might have a few, like Bond villains, North Korea or Nicaragua or Cuba, or Chavez, now Maduro in Venezuela hanging out with them. But they don't have real friends. And sometimes having friends is tough. I mean, Churchill said the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And so we have our disagreements, but it's important to have our friends around the world because they share our values. And even if they don't share all of our values, they hopefully want independence and sovereignty for their countries. And they're willing to stand up to the bullies. They're willing to stand up to the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians. And so that's a great advantage to the U.S. And so when America projects strength, and I agree with our conservative friends, we don't need to be in these forever wars. We need to get out of those. We don't need to be the world's policeman. But we do need to be what Ronald Reagan talked about, and that's the shining city on the hill, the beacon of liberty and democracy that because we're so strong, the rest of the world and even people who are oppressed can look to us and see like a hope and a brighter future because America exists.
Mm-hmm. And a model, right? I mean, just a model for liberty.
100%.
Yeah. When you and the rest of the architects of the Abraham Accord started talking about the general vision of this project, you had an idea that it would be more than just one piece, right? What was your vision there? And then how do you feel about it today?
Well, our first thought was, look, we wanted to get the Saudis involved. And we did. And look, the Abraham Accords would not have happened without Saudi Arabia because I don't think the UAE or Bahrain would have moved. But the Saudis weren't quite ready to be the first movers. And so we looked at who could be. And I had gotten to know MBZ, the crown prince of the UAE, during my hostage envoy days. And
right.
We trusted him to do what he said, and he trusted us to do what we'd say. And we built political capital with them. We helped them by isolating Iran. We sold them the weapons they needed to defend their country against Iran. And so we put capital in the bank, just like we did with Israel by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And so it started out with the UAE, and then Bahrain got involved, and then we moved from there to Sudan, and the Sudanese got involved. And a few months later, we got the Kingdom of Morocco on board, and we got Kosovo on board. So we really started developing some momentum. And I think the accords are going to be enduring. And I think that momentum could be redeveloped. I think that the Biden administration is trying to bring peace to the region. But it requires a lot of effort. It requires rolling up the sleeves, and it requires having point people that are making that a high priority for them.
Are there other countries that you think could have been involved if you kept the momentum and continued with the same plan?
Look, I think that can happen. I hope it happens sooner rather than later. And if the Biden administration is able to add some countries to the Abraham Accords, I'll be the first to be in the front row clapping for them.
On to another subject, yet related. Some of us are sitting here feeling like there are things bubbling around the world. We hear about what is happening right now in Iran, obviously Russia, China, and then, we live here in the United States trying to figure out what is going on, what is bubbling around. What are your thoughts on that?
So the question I used to get as National Security Advisor, and I still get it today, is what are the biggest threats to America? And I think that's maybe a different way to ask your question, and because there's a lot happening all over the world, and there's not a lot of good news out there, unfortunately, right now. I mean, certainly we've got the war in Ukraine, which is terrible, and what's happened to the Ukrainian people is just tragic. The number of people being killed. What's happened, frankly, to the Russian people because of this ill-thought-out war is a tragedy for them. And but when you look at the threats to the United States, there's a short-term threat, a day-to-day threat, and that comes from Iran, the Islamic Republic. They're constantly looking every day to try and push us out of the Middle East, to try and harm us. We have air bases in the region. We have naval bases in the region. They're constantly creating mischief and involved in malign activity. They're trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and they're trying to develop a nuclear weapon at the same time that they're trying to develop a ballistic weapon, the missile that can hit Israel. They call Israel a one-bomb country because they think one bomb can take out the whole country. So small. Because of the geographic size of Israel, they think they can take out 3 to 4 million people with one bomb. Horrific that a country would talk like that, and they don't believe Israel has the right to exist as a nation. But they also want those missiles that are long enough to hit Europe and America. And so that's and then there's the day-to-day terrorism that we see coming out of Iran. So they're very dangerous. And then the long-term threat to the country, the existential threat that we face, and we've never really faced, maybe since the revolution when we were fighting the British Empire and it was the most powerful country in the world, is the challenges presented by the Communist Party of China, a Marxist-Leninist regime that's seeking world domination. They don't hide that. They want to be the number one power in the world, and they want to impose their way of life on everyone. And they've been doing it regionally with Tibet and with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are subject to a genocide, to Hong Kong, to the threats against Taiwan. But their ambitions far outstrip even their neighborhood, and they'd like to impose their will on the United States of America, and we can't let that happen. So they're hardworking, they're clever, they're rich, they're a big country. It's quite a challenge for the United States.
So those are two major subjects. I want to kind of break them down a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Iran. If you are back as National Security Advisor, what advice would you give to the American government vis-a-vis Iran right now?
One thing I would never agree to, or would advise the president never agree to, and that is to going back into the JCPOA, that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was meant to eliminate and limit Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon. And it's done just the opposite. The Israelis, in a very daring operation, intelligence operation, actually got the entire nuclear archive from Iran. And it shows that Iran lied about their nuclear program from the start. It was a military program. They were seeking a bomb. They're currently seeking a bomb. And so to do anything that would legitimize what the Iranians are up to, in my opinion, is a big mistake. Number one, it will give the Iranians sanctions relief of hundreds of billions of dollars. And what they do with that money, remember the first JCPOA, everyone said, the Iranians will get all this money, we'll take the sanctions off, they'll become responsible actors, they'll play nicely in the neighborhood, they'll give the money to the Iranian middle class, and that Iran will blossom as a country. The Iranians didn't do that. They took the money, they took hostages, they gave it to the Houthis in Yemen, they gave it to Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, they gave it to Hezbollah in Lebanon, they supported the Assad regime, they gave it to Hamas, they supported terrorists all over the region, and then they built up this big ballistic missile program. None of that money went to the Iranian people. It didn't go to the middle class. It didn't go to poor people in Iran. It didn't go to the ethnic minorities in Iran. They're all suffering under the boot, and they're rising up to let the government know they don't like it now. And we hope for the best for the Iranian people as they protest against the government. But So number one, the idea that they would take this money and sanctions relief and use it for positive purposes it turned out to be a sham, and it was a total scam that the Iranians pulled on us. But number two, the agreement ends in 2 years. There's a sunset clause which will make Iran a legitimate nuclear power in 2 to 5 years, so that they'll have the right to enrich to whatever level they want, and that's a bad idea as well. So just overall, getting back into the JCPOA is not something we want to do. It'll lead to a nuclear arms race in the region. It'll lead to our friends and allies not having confidence in us, and it'll put our great ally Israel in real danger.
So what would you actively do right now if you had a chance to pivot away, and how would you respond to people saying, well, Ambassador, like, how could you be so heartless about the people who are suffering in Iran? Like, we need to give them money so that these people would be in better shape.
Well, there's always a humanitarian exception to sanctions. So if the Iranians really are buying food or medical devices or medical equipment that doesn't have dual use, they always want to import a bunch of radioactive material, and far more than they needed for people.
It's like, what are you going to do with that?
Far more than people with cancer in Iran. But exceptions for humanitarian and foodstuffs is something that has always been part of the American sanctions program. But putting maximum pressure on the Revolutionary Guard, on the Quds Force, on the regime, on the businesses that they own, really helps the region, because it keeps the Iranians from expanding and using that money to engage in malign activity in the region. So putting maximum pressure through sanctions and getting all the governments in the region to work with us on those sanctions and to really impose a blockade on an economic blockade on Iran is the first step you take. The second step is America's got to return to a peace through strength posture, which means having enough troops in the region, but also letting the Iranians know that if they cross certain lines, they're going to pay a price for it. And so we need deterrence, and we need maximum pressure economically.
What is the motive for not doing all these things that to me, they just seem obvious, right? If there was a bad actor that you're negotiating against and they just won't play ball and they're, sneaking things and lying to you and doing things anyway, what is the motive to just continue to play ball with them that way?
Look, appeasement's always popular in a democracy, right? Because you can kick the can down the road. And if you appease a dictator, just like we did with Hitler, and I think, Munich is overused as an analogy. Every moment isn't a Munich moment, but certainly dealing with the Iranians is a Munich moment. So if you appease them and you give them what they want, they're never going to be sated. They're just going to ask for more, more, more. And appeasement, when it's engaged in at the time, is always popular in a democracy, because you can come home like Chamberlain came home from Munich and said, we've got peace in our time. We won't have war with the Germans. Nobody wants war. No one wants conflict. Everyone likes peace. And if we can just give the bad guys what they want. I remember in President Obama's inaugural address, he said, if you'll unclench your fist, we'll reach out our hand to you. And there's this naivete that we don't believe what they say. When they say death to America, and when the Ayatollah says, we want to destroy the West.
Oh, they don't really mean that.
But they really do mean it.
They really do.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to us. We don't walk around chanting death to Iran and death to Ayatollah and that sort of thing. But they don't like our way of life. They don't like our liberty. They don't like our religious liberty. They don't like our freedoms. They don't like our freedom of speech.
I don't think they really like us.
No, they don't. And so instead of taking them at their word, we treat them like children and say, oh, if we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us.
Just give them another candy bar.
And we tried that with the JCPOA, and we saw the death and destruction that took place with all the terrorism that they used the money for. I mean, they took all that sanction relief and really created a lot of mischief in the Middle East, and a lot of people died as a result of it.
Talking about problems around the world, I think China is our biggest problem. It doesn't seem like you disagree on that one. Tell me what worries you about China right now.
Well, what worries me about China is you've got President Xi going into his third term, so he's basically becoming a dictator for life. The Chinese have shown a penchant for expansionism. They took Tibet, which used to be, the left used to be concerned about the Dalai Lama in Tibet, but they're so eager to appease the Chinese and give them what they want that they've forgotten about Tibet. They've forgotten about the Dalai Lama. Hong Kong was a beacon of democracy in the region, and we had this idea that there'd be one country, two systems. And the Chinese said, we'll let them have two systems for 50 years. We'll let them have liberty for 50 years when they took Hong Kong back from the British. And they lied. They shut it down. They clamped it down. There's no democracy in Hong Kong. Now the Chinese are threatening Taiwan, which is a wonderful, vibrant democracy, 28 million people, wonderful place, and I've been there many times. And China now wants to impose communist rule on the democracy of Taiwan, and so the Communist Party of China is not going to stop until it controls everything. And it would be bad enough if it was just in Asia, Marissa, if it was just in China, or even what the Chinese consider as China, which is a very expansive view of things. But it's not just there; it's here.
Yeah.
So when the general manager of the Houston Rockets had the temerity to tweet in favor of the democracy protesters in Hong Kong, the Chinese brought all of their economic power to bear on the NBA and on the Houston Rockets. And you had a series of athletes and executives at the NBA and Nike kowtowing to the Chinese, apologizing, bowing and scraping before the new emperor of China, Xi Jinping. And so they don't want any free speech here. I mean, you see it with their students who come here to study. They're all monitored. They're all monitored on WeChat. If anyone gets out of line, the Chinese will go to their family in China. They'll threaten them here. They've kidnapped Chinese dissidents from other countries and brought them back to China. It's a very dangerous situation because the Chinese are feeling so confident in their ability to shape world opinion and to influence governments abroad that they're not just limiting themselves to a total surveillance society in China and imposition of a Marxist-Leninist government in China. They want to extend that domination everywhere, including to us. And they don't like our way of life.
And so would your answer be to my ongoing question, what is the motive behind why isn't our government actually taking care of this and stopping it? Is it the same answer? They just want to push the can down the road. They just don't want to deal with it. It's so big. It's so overwhelming. They're just like, let the next government deal with that?
Well, it is a huge problem, but one of the things we did in our administration is we changed the focus and we helped develop a bipartisan consensus that China was a great threat to our way of life, not just to our power as a country, not just geopolitically, but to how we live every day, how Americans go about their business. And that threat has been recognized. I think it's been recognized on the Democrat side. I think I rarely compliment Nancy Pelosi, but it was great that she went to Taiwan, and Chuck Schumer has been tough on China. And so I think we changed the consensus, and I think the Biden administration is keeping a lot of our policies on China in place. I think they could go further and keep the momentum going, but at least they're not rolling back, for the most part, the policies that we put in place. There have been a few things that we disagree with them on, like on TikTok and others, but I think there's an American consensus and there's a growing Western consensus now that people are now, to use a liberal phrase, woke to what the Chinese are up to. But having said that, the Chinese have tremendous influence. I mean, they're very heavily involved in the American banking and finance sector. And so there are a lot of folks on Wall Street that will do whatever the Chinese tell them to do. And a lot of very famous executives that go out of their way to shill for the Chinese and excuse the Chinese and make excuses for the genocide that's taking place in Xinjiang. I mean, we literally have human beings who are being used as slaves to pick cotton in Western China. And no one's upset about it here. And people say, well, it's China, it's not our business. We've always said never again, but it's happening again. And the idea was for many years, and this happened to Republican and Democrat administrations, we thought, look, if we trade with the Chinese, if we turn a blind eye to their intellectual property theft, if we allow all their students to come here to our universities and steal our technology and take it home, if we allow them to dump their products here and undercut American businesses, if we ship our factories to China, if we let them export their opioids and their fentanyl here and just pretend like none of it's happening, China will become rich. And as they become rich, they'll become more moderate, and they'll become more democratic, and they'll become more like us. And it turned out that wasn't true. They became rich, and they became more Marxist-Leninist.
And hungrier.
And wanting more power, and more and more and more, and they want world domination. So it's not the old days of Deng, where he said, let's hide our power and our ambitions and hide and abide and work with the West. Now we've got Xi Jinping, who's made it very clear that he intends to run the world.
I don't have nearly as much exposure and awareness as you do, but even to me, just, a mom in Los Angeles is running a media company, it feels like China is so intertwined with so much of what is happening in our daily lives, right? Whether it's, the businesses that you mentioned, TikTok that, America's kids are on. I read that they've been buying land close to American military bases. And so it just feels like they're here for some long game. And we're just kind of, moseying around and going along with whatever is happening. And are we going to wake up at one moment and say, wait a second, like China is just literally everywhere?
So it's a little bit of whack-a-mole, but the Chinese are engaged in an all-spectrum competition with us. Cultural. I mean, they've put so much money into the movie industry that they really control big chunks of Hollywood now. And you can't have. I mean, you look at the Red Dawn sequel, which was supposed to be the Chinese invading the U.S. That had to be changed to North Korea. You know, you can't criticize China in any movie scripts. I mean, Richard Gere, who's a major star, can't get a job because he stood by the Dalai Lama. The amount of power that they have
in the United States.
In the United States.
Richard Gere can't get a job in the United States.
He can't get movie roles because the Chinese say that you won't show that film in China or we won't finance it. And so whether it's the gaming industry, which relies on licenses for their casinos in Macau, or the finance industry that's pouring American retirees money into China, which is a whole other story, whether it's the movie industry that wants to sell movies to China. The Chinese have influence in all those places, and they use the influence, and they use it to advance their agenda. And there are plenty of Americans who are making enough money off China that they're willing to sell their soul to the government in Beijing. And this is not just, this isn't like dealing with the Brits and saying, oh, I like England, or I like France, or I like Italy, or I like Israel. These aren't democracies. These aren't friends of ours. This is a very brutal regime. It's a Marxist-Leninist regime that's engaged in a genocide. But they're willing to do everything, and we've got to stop them. And I mean, this idea that we're allowing the Chinese state-owned enterprises, state companies, to buy farmland, which is important to us for food security, but to buy farmland, to put radio devices on that farmland, to put cell phone towers on that farmland, and to do it right next to our missile bases or next to our Air Force bases is absurd. I mean, can you imagine if an American company went to China and said, we want to buy all this land next to your rocket division, your strategic nuclear forces, and we're going to buy a couple hundred acres, and we're going to build a bunch of stuff here. You don't need to worry about what's on it. It's all good. We've got it taken care of. I mean, it's absurd. The Chinese would never allow it. There's no reciprocity.
It's just mind-boggling that we're allowing that to happen.
And it's got to stop immediately. I mean, this is something that the Biden administration and state governments need to get on top of immediately. Americans were into free enterprise and want people to be able to sell their land for the highest and best price. But we're spending trillions and trillions of dollars on COVID. If we need to pay farmers who otherwise want to sell their land to the Chinese, if the American government needs to buy it, let's find the money and buy it.
Incredible. I mean, it's really scary. And one of the things that I've been engaged with regularly is TikTok. I notice the type of footage that is coming up on these kids' phones. And I've been hearing that actually TikTok, if you use TikTok in China, the algorithm is set up so that they're actually getting this math competitions and civic duties, and then in America they're actually serving an algorithm where kids are watching pornographic images and kids getting drunk and taking drugs and adding to the fentanyl crisis. And so this is like one of these additional ways that it just feels like they're coming towards us.
The TikTok thing is very scary. So one of the things we did in the Trump administration is we banned TikTok from the U.S. and India has banned TikTok, and India's banned 200 Chinese apps because the Indians want to protect their people from these applications, which are doing, number one, they're sucking up all your biometric data. So if you go on TikTok, every bit of personal information on your phone, your eyes, the way you speak, your voice patterns, all of that is getting sucked up and put into a database, and that the Chinese government has access to. And there have been recent reports that the Chinese government has been accessing data that's supposedly staying here in America from TikTok. So there's a privacy and data concern that's great. But I was with a tech executive last night, one of the most prominent guys in tech, and he said that the algorithms that TikTok is using are they're incredibly subtle, and they're very powerful. And what they're being used for is to divide Americans. So when it comes to politics, they're trying to create controversy between us and drive us apart. Not only it's a data issue and a privacy issue, but it's also an issue that they're trying to tear us apart as Americans, because if they can put us in two different corners, if they can polarize us, that's good for the Chinese.
Of course. I mean, so I have a lot of friends in tech, both because of my experience in the Israeli military in 8200, but also just, here, I live in California. I do have some friends in Silicon Valley, I admit it. None of them allow their kids to be on TikTok. And frankly, many of them don't even allow their kids to be on social media. And I know it's really hard as a parent to be that mean parent who doesn't allow it, but because they do understand how dangerous this is, they toughen up and they don't expose their kids to some of this horrible stuff.
The tech titan I was with last night has 2 young daughters, and they're not even allowed to go on an iPad. They don't. So the people that know it best.
Yes.
Don't want it. Now, look, tech can do a lot of great things, and it's one of the tremendous advantages we have as a country is we've got some of these great tech companies, and we may not like the censorship or some of the deplatforming and that sort of thing, but for the most part, we're staying ahead of the Chinese, not because of the U.S. government and our research, but because of our great tech companies, whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple, these companies. We need to make sure they stay strong and we stay ahead of the Chinese, but we also need to make sure that those tech companies are working with the United States, they're working with the Defense Department, and so I think we're doing some things to fight back on the tech front with China. The CHIPS Act was a great thing, so we'll get Intel and other American chip makers, Western Digital and others, to hopefully build factories here in America. So we need to stay in the tech game. And one last point I'll make is that you mentioned Israel. One of the great advantages that we have in the tech war with China is Israel. I mean, I would take Israel with 9 million people over China with 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion people every day of the year. I mean, Tel Aviv is the second Silicon Valley. So almost everything we touch that's tech related has some aspect of it's being worked on in Israel. And for a country its size, talk about punching above its weight. The combination of the U.S. and Israel means we can't be defeated in a tech war unless we defeat ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many benefits of that relationship. Yeah. One of the things that I think about as you speak about the issues with some of these technology companies just kind of working independently and not thinking about what's best for the United States of America, I understand that point, but I would also imagine that some folks who are very pro-free market say, well, we don't want the government to go and tell the tech companies what to do, because that would be a problem too. And we're hearing about, the current administration telling Facebook what to censor and what not to censor. And we all take, issue with that. And so how do we kind of reconcile both of those situations?
Yeah, so it's like we've always had these concerns, and they're legitimate antitrust concerns that some of these tech companies are getting too big. But what's happening is, and there's legislation out there like this Klobuchar legislation and other legislation that's saying that tech companies have to open up their phone to every app in the world. That's just going to lead to a bunch of Chinese apps getting put on phones that are not vetted, that are dangerous, and so 10 of the top 20 tech companies in the world now are based in Beijing. So we may get upset with big tech, or we may not like, whether if you're liberal, you may not like the disinformation. If you're conservative, you don't like the fact that President Trump was deplatformed from Facebook or Twitter. There's censorship going on. PragerU had some issues early on with YouTube that were totally unfair. We can deal with those issues, but killing those companies and then having everything based in Beijing is the wrong answer. I think as Americans, we can figure out how to work with our tech companies and take advantage of the research on AI and quantum computing and machine learning and all the things we need, space and satellite transmissions of the internet, which we saw has played such a critical role in Ukraine with Elon Musk's Starlink. So there's a lot of good that can come from tech, and we need to work with our tech companies, destroying them, which is, I understand why folks on the right and left throw up their arms and just say, hey, we've had enough of tech, let's just destroy the companies. That's not the answer, right, because what we'll be left with then is China running everything.
There'll be a vacuum and China will just step into that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's an incredible perspective on that one. It's so scary. I mean, some of the things that you're sharing, really, it's hard to just think about what's going to happen. Is A, do you have any hope? B, does the hope even matter? And I would say, what do you feel like somebody who is watching this outside of this room? What can we do? What can Americans do to respond to some of the things that you've been thinking about? I mean, we can't make policy and we can't really tell, TikTok to disappear. Is there anything that those of us out there who really care about our country and want to have a hopeful future can do?
Well, first of all, we've got to be optimistic about the United States of America. This is the greatest country in the history of the world, and it still is. And we go through our political ups and downs, and we have our fights, and we have for 250 years. But fundamentally, America's strong. We're strong geographically. We've got 2 oceans protecting us. We've got, and look, that's changed a little because of cyber and space, but we've got good neighbors for the most part with Canada and Mexico. We've got all the resources we need. So we've been blessed by God with tremendous resources. We've got great people here. We've got a diverse country. We have great immigrants, especially the ones who sign the guest book and come in legally, and everybody wants to come here. And when you look around the world, what are the options? Do people want to go to Russia? I mean, heck no. I mean, the Russian, I just read today that every seat on every airplane leaving Russia for the next 3 months is taken because people are trying to flee Russia. The Chinese, half the Communist Party of Chinese Central Committee have bolt homes, bug out homes in the U.S. and Canada. And their kids come to school here, and much of their kids secretly have U.S. passports. As Ronald Reagan said, we're the last best hope of mankind, and I think he meant womankind as well as that, on the face of the earth. So we've got to remain optimistic. We've got to value and cherish what we have. And we've got to understand that fundamentally, we're an incredibly strong country. We're not going to get defeated by the Chinese. We might defeat ourselves, but the Chinese aren't going to defeat us. The Russians aren't going to defeat us, especially when we're teamed with our allies, Canada and Australia and the U.S. and the U.K. and New Zealand, our Five Eyes allies, our NATO allies, Japan, Israel. I mean, we've got incredible allies around the world. To be leaders of the free world and to instill fear in our adversaries and respect in our adversaries and goodwill among our friends is we have to go back to a peace through strength posture. And we had that in the Trump administration. We had it in the Reagan administration. We've got to go back to people understanding that the U.S. means business and that we're not going to be pushed around. We're not going to have an Afghanistan type withdrawal ever happen again. We're not going to have the Russians just come into Ukraine because it's a, quote, minor incursion. We've got to go back to leading the free world and building up our military in a way that'll deter any foe from ever trying to cause harm to America or its allies. So that's the overall perspective. So I'm bullish on America. I think the next 100 years can be another American century. What do we do personally? Keep your kids off TikTok. Delete it from their phones. It's a terrible app. Do the same thing with WeChat. And if you're Chinese American and you can communicate with people back home, try and figure out a way to do it that doesn't go through the Chinese servers. And we need to get rid of all these Chinese apps that are on everyone's phones and computers and tablets. So that's one thing. But you can do some of that yourself. Have good cyber hygiene. Don't respond to the phishing. When people tell you that Amazon is going to send you $1,000, Jeff Bezos isn't sending you $1,000 for clicking on a link. And with your kids in school, if you can send them to a parochial school or a parish school or a conservative school, do it. But if you can't, or if you're in a place where you like the public schools, and my kids went to public school in a city called La Cañada, which has some great schools there, when they get home, find out what the teachers are teaching them. And if you don't like what's being taught, make yourself known to the PTA and make yourself known to the teachers. And you're not a domestic terrorist if you don't want Marxism taught to your sixth grader. I mean,
they'll just treat you like one.
They might treat you like one, and you might get investigated. But if you can't change the schools, at least get your kids on PragerU in the afternoon.
Inoculate them.
Show them the 5-minute videos and make them, before they turn on the Disney Channel, make them watch 2 or 3 5-minute Prager sessions. And so get involved in your kids' education. Get involved in your communities. Be nice to your neighbors and love your Democrat friends if you're a Republican, and if you're a Democrat, love your Republican friends. But realize that we're all Americans. Yeah,
China wants us fighting.
They do.
That's what they want us
Russia
to do.
Russia does as well, and the Iranians do also.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I learned so much.
Oh, great to be with you, Marissa.
I really enjoyed it.
My privilege. Thank you.